Welcome to the Startup of the Year podcast, where each episode we showcase exciting new companies from around the world. This podcast is produced by Established, creators of the Startup of the Year program. Established is focused on helping organizations with their innovation, startup, and communication strategies.
Welcome back to the Startup of the Year podcast. I'm Frank Gruber, the co-founder and co-CEO of Established, co-founder of Established Ventures, and the team behind the Startup of the Year community and this very podcast. Thank you for being here. We know you have lots of choices in podcasts and appreciate you choosing us, at least for now, right? You've probably got other podcasts too, but thanks for listening. On this episode, we're going to talk with Susan McPherson, who's a serial connector, angel investor, and corporate responsibility expert. She's the founder and CEO of McPherson Strategies, and she's the author of the new book, The Lost Art of Connecting, the Gather, Ask, Do method for building meaningful relationships. She's also invests in and advises women-led technology startups. And she's a member of the MIT Solve Women Technology Leadership Group and serves as an advisor to several nonprofits. Before we jump in, though, I wanted to mention two things. We got two things for you today. First, last week was America's Seed Fund Week. It was put on by the SBA, the U.S. Small Business Administration. And basically, if you didn't get a chance to learn about what might be possible for you and the funds available potentially for your company from the various agencies of this $4 billion a year fund for tech startups, don't worry, don't fret. The recordings are out there. They're over at americasseedfund.us. Again, it's Americas with an S, seedfund.us. You can watch all the videos and learn more about the opportunities potentially for your startup or business. And if you get that going and you think that's pretty interesting, you can also go check out sbir.gov to learn more about America's Seed Fund. All right. Also, we're going to continue our second point, which is more or less highlighting a startup from our community, which today's is very appropriate. The company is Mind VR, which fights isolation and improves the lives of older adults using virtual reality. Mind VR provides virtual reality subscription bundles to senior living communities, veteran homes, and other healthcare providers, and also directly to older adults aging in their own homes. The company has an uplifting message and has been featured on tons of different publications, including Good Morning America, Fox News, CNN, Forbes, Washington Post, and dozens more. To learn more, just simply go to their website. It's www.myndvr.com. It's again, myndvr.com. That's Mind VR. Very interesting stuff. All right, now let's jump into my conversation with Susan McPherson. All right, thanks so much, Susan, for joining us today. Really appreciate you being here. And for our listeners, they may not know about what you're up to, but could you just start by talking about what McPherson Strategies is and how you got going into that, and then we'll jump into your book.
Absolutely, Frank, and it's a joy to be with you here today. Thank you so much. I founded McPherson Strategies about 9 years ago, 9 years next month, and it was a placeholder until I found my next job. And now we have 17 employees and about 17 clients. And we do impact communication. So we work with corporations, NGOs, foundations on how they communicate the impact they are having in the world.
Very cool. Very cool. So we're going to talk about impact then later in the conversation. But let's start with the book. You had a book come out, The Lost Art of Connecting, the Gather, Ask, Do method for building meaningful relationships. It came out during the middle of a pandemic, and obviously not planned, but would love to hear from you how that went. Well, first off, congratulations. I know writing a book is immensely hard, and it's a big effort of time and everything. And obviously then the launch and all that's a whole nother effort. So congrats, but I want to get your take on how that's all gone and how it's going.
Well, interestingly enough, when people see the title, they assume I wrote it in response to the pandemic, but it was actually conceived in 2018. And the book proposal was picked up in 2019, and I started writing it in February of 2020. So
just shows you how slow that process is.
Yeah, talk about an industry that needs to be disrupted.
Yep.
Frank, I think that's your next next journey ahead.
Yep.
But writing it during the pandemic was somewhat cathartic because I interviewed about 35 business leaders who made connecting an integral part of their career journey and truly felt that building connections led to their success. And somehow interviewing them during the loneliest time in my life, because I live alone, I don't have a significant other, parents, or children. So you can imagine during the pandemic how stiflingly quiet that was. I imagine there are people in your audience, however, though, probably that sounded delightful, considering they were trapped with probably many, many children and parents and all the things, but I digress. And but the theme or the notion of the behind the book was back to disrupting what we traditionally think of networking, and leading with how we can be helpful to others, rather than in traditional networking where you walk into a room where it's all about what can I get, what can I gain, how can these people help me? So flipping the switch and leading with how can I be helpful to others? How can I tap my superpowers and my knowledge and my guidance to be able to give to others and build meaningful connections around that? And launching a book in the middle of a pandemic, April of 2021, certainly I would not recommend to anyone. However, it was a lot of Zoom talks, a lot of podcasts, no celebration. But one of the beauties, because of the subject matter, is a year later, we're still talking about it, because as people now have adjusted to this hybrid world, connection is no longer kind of like oh yeah, maybe, but it's something that leaders, entrepreneurs, founders, C-suite know that to have a successful organization, you have to do everything you can to drive connection.
Absolutely. I mean, the world changed, right? I mean,
yeah,
it hasn't gone, and a lot of things haven't gone back as far as people going to the office. And, now we're talking about that, but then we're also now talking of hearing, the 4-day work week and all this. There's a lot of different takes on, and it's all, I think, because of that, what happened with the pandemic. So, and we've also had starts and stops, right? During that time you launched it, if I remember back then, people were starting to get vaccinated, and it was almost like we can go out again and do things. And then here we come with another wave of COVID, right? So, all right, let's jump into your method. I mean, you have a specific method, and you used some reflection to come up with that method, because you've been doing this forever, almost on autopilot. And so just want to how did you break it down, turn it into a method, and put it into a book? And what does that method look like?
Well, I learned when you write a business book, you have to come up with a methodology, or guess what? You don't get a business book to write. But just being silly. But I had been a connector since, I was probably 5 or 6 years old, and I was the product of parents who were serial connectors. But it was probably about 6 years into my company's trajectory that I noticed that our business was inbound, almost all. And we tracked it, and it turned out within 90%, and even to this day, 90% of our business is inbound. So what that told me was there's something there about connections. Yes, they're all well and good, and they're fun and meaningful, but there's money to be made. And I don't mean to sound crass, but you have audience members who are founders and building businesses. And quite frankly, everything comes from our connections. Everything good in our lives comes from connections. But when I looked back over the last 35 years professionally, I realized that I actually did have a methodology, and that is called the Gather, Ask, Do. So I'll give you a kind of a 30,000-foot view of what that looks like. In the gather phase, you connect with the most important person in your life, and I bet you can guess who that is. It's yourself.
Yeah, I figured.
And when you connect with yourself, you think deeply about what your superpowers are. And notice I have a plural to that because we have many of them. And then you think about what your goals are for the next, let's say, 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. And you think about who you want to connect with and reconnect with that are going to help you meet those goals. But the reason knowing your superpowers is so important is the underlying notion of the entire book is leading with how you can be helpful. So if you don't know your superpowers, how can you be helpful to others? Lastly, in the gather phase, you think about how you can break that hermetically sealed bubble that so many of us live in, myself included, where we tend to attract and stay close with people who look like us, sound like us, the same age, race, and color as us. The next phase is the ask phase. And at the ask phase is where you learn to ask the meaningful questions of others to find out what their hopes and dreams are. So you can then be helpful, and go to the do phase, which is my favorite phase. And that's where you take all the information you have learned from the persons or people that you're talking to, and you become reliable, trustworthy, responsive. You do what you say you're going to do. So that is the gather, ask, do. And I think, certainly living through this pandemic the last few years, it's healthy to kind of go through this every few months as an exercise to kind of think about your goals and the communities in which you exist and operate in.
And that approach, applies to in person or, virtual as well, right? It doesn't really change.
Yeah. Absolutely. And if anything, another reasons I wrote this book was I thought, or at least I felt, we had become slaves to our technology. Now, I am not a Luddite by any stretch of the imagination. And if we didn't have Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Google Meetup and phones and social media and everything, this pandemic would have even been harder than it already was. But I do believe that the silver lining through this is it has made us more intentional when we zap off a text or send off a WhatsApp or an email. I think we are more mindful about our connections and the meanings behind them than we were previously.
Yeah, I would have to agree. So anyone that kind of lost touch with people during the pandemic, they should go through and do that method and start figuring out who have I not talked to in a while and would like to continue to connect with. Is that a good approach?
I love that, because sometimes we forget that we have incredible connections that we have made and built over the years. And I think sometimes we're reticent to reach out because, oops, we dropped the ball. But use the pandemic for that. Right. It harmed us. Why not take advantage of it?
Well, and I think people also do that around collisions that happen naturally around travel, let's say, or for maybe in your neighborhood. And if those aren't happening, what do you do? How do you, maybe you don't even know who those people are, by their name, because you just see the same people at the coffee shop or whatever. So I guess you got to be a little bit more intentional there too, right?
Absolutely. And, the other thing to remember is, you will get ghosted sometimes. It's a fact of life. Yeah. And as hard as it may be, at least you tried, and you get an A+ for trying. That's my outlook on that.
That makes sense. And I wanted to go back to something you just mentioned a little bit ago when you were explaining the method. You talked about figuring out your superpowers, and that's, keyed my interest. So how did you, I think there's been books and stuff written about this, but I wanted to get your take on how you approach, figuring out your superpower.
Well, it is hard. And I am probably one of the most, typical woman in her mid-50s where she questions everything and, has imposter syndrome. But I have to say, you need to audit yourself. And sometimes it means asking others. Sometimes it means asking your spouse or your best friend or, your dry cleaner or your dog. But sometimes asking others gives you a different reflection in the mirror than, say, looking at your own self. But I think it's healthy to have a notepad and pencil and really write down, are you a good cook? Are you, multilingual? Are you a good writer? We all have things that we can be helpful to others with. And I think sometimes we're the first people to say, no, there's nothing we're good at, when in actuality, there are many, 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 many things. It may not be rocket science, but how many rocket scientists do we really know anyway? Right.
No, and it's probably just negative self-talk talking you off that you're saying you don't have those traits. So that's helpful. I think, what if you're an introvert? Because a lot of folks that might be just really good developers or really good at graphic design or really good at other kind of IT or other things that are not putting them in front of people. What do you do then?
Well, for instance, when people say to me, oh, I'm in my early 20s and I'm just starting out, how could I actually be helpful? And I immediately say to them, do you know how to use TikTok? Help me use TikTok. And if it's a programmer, oh my goodness, think of all the computer issues that, you probably help your parents with, right? So Everybody has superpowers, okay? Yep. In terms of introverts and extroverts, I will say, there's a reason I called the book The Lost Art of Connecting versus The Lost Art of Networking. Connecting is much more 1-to-1, 1-to-2. Networking is much more 1-to-50, which for an introvert is terrifying. But one-on-one is somewhat less daunting. And I also say that I love to call it the power of three, whether you're going to a virtual event or a, traditional event. Try to find out who's going to be in the room before you go, which is a gift that we often have these days. Years ago, when I was first kind of coming of age, you didn't have the chance to know who was going to be in the room before you went. Now, almost every event, there's like a website or a platform. And think about intentionally, who is it that you want to meet? But the power of three is go with the goal to meet three people, share three things about yourself, and learn three things about the people you meet. And then you can go hide in the bathroom or, order room service from your hotel room. And again, you can do this in a virtual setting too, but it could be the power of two, it could be the power of four, but set those types of goals for yourself, because then it doesn't become so daunting and terrifying walking into these rooms.
Yeah, it gamifies it in a way, right? Like you're like, I got to do this. This is what I'm thinking. So, okay, that's really interesting. And because of that, I lost my train of thought on what my next question was going to be. But, but it was something into the fact of how do you apply this now? Let's say you're a founder and you're trying to build relationships and people you don't know. And you mentioned like you can do your research ahead. I mean, is it a similar process? Like you're trying to you meet a certain investor, or try to find mentors or partners. How do you recommend, or what's your approach there?
I love this question because I get to share that in the 80s, one of my first real jobs was working for USA Today. And I used to research people before I would call them and interview them. And the tools I had were the Encyclopedia Britannica and the Yellow Pages. And the Yellow Pages.
Nice.
Today, when we reach out to people that we don't know, we have absolutely no excuse to not find some way we can be helpful to them. Right. It's yes, there is going to be a smattering of people on this planet that are stealth and you can't find anything. Yeah. But the vast majority of people, you can find their career trajectory on LinkedIn. You can find out what they're angry or upset about on Twitter. You can find out if they have grandchildren on Instagram. There are so many ways you can find out, so that I like to say you can find the commonalities in the uncommonalities.
Yeah.
So number one, do 10 minutes of research before you reach out and connect. And by all means, when you connect with somebody on LinkedIn, don't try to sell them something or fundraise from them within the first 5 minutes that you interact with them. Offer something,
I'm sure you get a lot of those too, as you've got probably angel investor in your bio, so you're probably getting pitched things directly all the time.
Absolutely. And even the first week of my book launch, I received an email from a lovely woman who I guess had heard me give a talk a few years ago at an entrepreneurial conference. And granted, I'm no one famous, et cetera. But that week, the email was, "Dear Susan, I heard you speak at blah, blah, blah conference. Would you mind if I picked your brain this week? Because I have da, 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 da going on." And I thought to myself, what a missed opportunity to say, again, I want to remember, I'm not trying to be on my high horse or anything, but it's just, that would have been such a good example to say, "Susan, I understand you just launched a book. Is there anything I can do to be helpful? And, oh, by the way," and that is the way when we reach out to people, we should see if there's something. And again, it doesn't have to be writing a check for $1 million. Maybe it's an introduction to a funder. Maybe it's a podcast or a newsletter they should subscribe to, or maybe it's a shout out on any of the social media platforms. Instead of diving right in. I mean, I hate to be crass, but it's a little like, asking for sex on the first date.
Right. No, that makes sense. No, totally. I mean, that's what it sounds like. So yeah, that's great advice. And it's basically, to paraphrase, it's like, don't be lazy when you're trying to meet new people. Like, figure out, do a little bit of research. Yeah. Like, you got the internet, it's pretty powerful, way better than the phone book. And then, obviously, when you do actually build those connections, maybe ask a little bit more about them than telling about yourself. So love it. Great advice. And I know you mentioned at the beginning, you're working with different impact or organizations to create impact, right? And I was curious on how startup founders can kind of address that, or have you seen startup founders addressing that early, even though maybe they're just getting their things going? Like,
You mean in
what
terms of building connections?
just in general, like how do they approach like making an impact if they're not an impact startup? Have you seen a lot of that, or I'm curious on
Yeah,
your take.
I mean, certainly now. I mean, in the early years of working in corporate responsibility, I very much only saw it as a purview of, the Fortune 500.
Right.
And for many, reasons that they did business in the EU where it was required, to be reporting on your carbon footprint, et cetera.
Right.
But now from a whole plethora of things, transparency, social media, Gen Z and millennials wanting to work for companies that they believe to be, purpose driven, you now can't, you almost have to deal with it. And I think with startups, when I advise them is start with your own people and find out what they care about and bring them along on the journey. It's also, if you are a startup, it's a lot easier to turn a rowboat around than a cruise ship, right? So it's very, very good to put in policies early on that limit the amount of waste you produce. If you produce products, if you really take care to look at your supply chain and make sure you are doing business with reputable suppliers that are also making sustainability an important, part of their journey. And then think about the philanthropic give back that you can give. I mean, philanthropy doesn't solve everything, and sometimes it can be a Band-Aid, but if you start early, you're building a company that is going to have a philanthropic side to it, which is going to make it much more interesting for people to buy from and to join you and, to be an employee or a funder or an investor. It's also a great way. I mean, it used to be a great way to stand out because no one was doing it. Now, it's becoming much more commonplace. But I'm always, I don't hear what I used to hear, and that was, we're not profitable yet, so we're not going to pay attention to it.
Right. So, and it's great advice to say, start at the beginning, get it going right away, so you have it in kind of ingrained in your culture.
Yes.
That's great. All right. So you also you advise companies. You've done, angel investing as well. What do you look for when you're like looking to advise or join a company as an investor?
Frank, you're going to hit me over the head when I tell you this. I fall in love with the founder.
No, that's great.
Would never recommend you follow my investing advice.
No, I think it's important. I mean, having good, strong founders is part of it, because they're gonna push through if you believe in them, in the way that you do. So I think that is a really important factor for sure.
Yes, but I should look under the hood.
Definitely look under the hood too. Yes, both.
I have invested in 22 women-led startups in the last 10 years. 2 have gone away, disappeared. Actually 3. And I have yet to make a dime on any of the others. I'm not giving up, but that is a lesson learned. But I also am a huge believer in helping people on their journey. And maybe it is because I'm not putting kids through college, so that kind of little extra slush fund is really helpful. I also know, we still live in a world where significant, there's lopsidedness in what funding goes to women and women of color.
Absolutely.
So if in my little world, if I can be doing something to help sway that, change that, I feel it's as important as the philanthropic work I do, or the philanthropy I give.
That makes a lot of sense. That's really great. So I guess one more, question, and then we can kind of wrap here. Words of advice, though, for any founders, women founders or minority founders out there. You have, invested in a bunch. What are things you tell them as advisors? What are some kind of common things?
Well, I'm a big believer, again, and you won't be surprised by this, but tap into your community. Don't be afraid to ask others, but offer up. Again, I know I sound like a broken record, but we are conditioned, especially as women, to be afraid to ask for things. There's no reason we can't be asking for things, but we just have to make sure we put in some sort of offer at the same time. And I'm also, a big believer in staying in touch with people. I know we all feel we're tapped for time, but it doesn't have to be anything more than a simple text or a call out on social media, just to let people know you're thinking of them. And, that way, 6 months from now, when you do make that ask for either fundraising or support or, sign this petition or what have you, people are going to be much more likely to glom on. So, I know there's no rocket science there, and in that advice, but it takes a village to do anything and to do anything successfully. So don't be afraid to build a village around you.
Great advice. And I think really what you're talking about is managing your own community, which is super important, as everyone kind of has their own set of fans, followers, friends. And that's great advice. So thank you so much, Susan McPherson, for joining us today. The book is out there. You can go get it pretty much everywhere books are sold. The Lost Art of Connecting, the Gather, Ask, Do method for building meaningful relationships. Susan, thanks so much.
Frank, it was a joy. Thank you.
Oh, one more question. Where can they connect with you if they need to? I'm assuming social.
You can find me on all the social platforms at Susan McP1, and my company is McPherson Strategies. And then the book is thelostartofconnecting.com.
All right. Some great advice from Susan. Really appreciate her being here. She's an expert, and check out her book. Go get it if you can. It's out there pretty much where all books are sold. All right. Hopefully you enjoyed the conversation. And if you did, please do share it with somebody you think might find this helpful. Maybe it's somebody that's learning to connect or needs to connect better, or maybe somebody that's super isolated. Sharing is caring, and really could be helpful to send that text or send that email to somebody sharing the episode, and maybe they can learn from this. All right. And finally, as always, if you have a startup idea and you want to get it started, haven't started yet, get it going today. Today is the best day to start up. Get it going, get it iterating. And in doing so, I encourage you to join our community for access to support, expert advice, and all the resources you would need to elevate your startup by simply going to startupofyear.com, filling out the application there, or going to soty.link/apply, APPLY, filling out the application there, and joining our community right away. It's a lot of fun. There's a lot of great people in it, and I'm sure you'll gather benefit from doing so. Until next time, I'm Frank Gruber. Don't forget to get out there today or tomorrow. Enjoy the summer while it lasts. Hug your loved ones and have a great time, and good luck starting up. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to the Startup of the Year podcast. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll be back with another episode soon.